If you take your seat, we'll get started. So we're going to switch gears a little bit this afternoon and talk about something that is a little less tangible than revenue impacts of wind, and that has to do with values. So no less important, the harder to quantify. So with respect to wind, values often come into play when we think about how people perceive wind turbines on the horizon. And that's something that Viewsheds will be a theme throughout this panel discussion. Our next moderator will be Milward Simpson, who many of you know, who last year took over as director of the Wyoming Nature Conservancy. Prior to that position, Milward was the director of the Wyoming Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. And he will moderate this final panel on Viewsheds, and he'll introduce the panelists. So thank you, Milward, for doing it.
My pleasure, thank you. So this has been a very informative day. We've had some great discussions about many of the more objective and quantifiable aspects of this complex issue. So we move now firmly into the subjective. This panel asks us to attempt to take into account Wyoming's Western identity and its values when looking at the wind energy question and the inevitable trade-offs involved. In Wyoming, our identity is closely tied to place, and for us, part of that means the vast, undisturbed lands and wide open spaces, viewsheds as they're referred to for the purposes of today's discussion. Our cultural and political values flow from and are closely tied to this special sense of place. So to facilitate this discussion, we're fortunate to be joined by four passionate and longtime Wyomingites representing the energy industry, land advocacy, citizens groups, the state legislature, and the historic preservation community, all who I think it's fair to say, despite their varied backgrounds, are likely to share many of these subjective definitions of our identity. I'm not going to read the entire bios, I'll just kind of quickly summarize them for you. But first of all, to my right, we're fortunate to have with us Lander native, Cale. He holds a PhD in Resource and Environmental Economics. He spent 35 years working in the utility industry, and during that time has worked on a number of energy issues, including renewables, for municipal utilities districts, European government agencies, and with NGOs working in numerous countries, including Nigeria. A long-term member of the Wyoming Senate, Cale chairs corporations and serves on the Revenue Committee. And Cale, thank you for your long service to the state. Certainly enjoyed working with you when I was in the executive branch, and look forward to today's discussion. Seated next to him, Loyd. Mr. Drain is the former executive director of the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, stepping down in late 2015. He holds a BS in Industrial Engineering from Texas A&M and a Juris Doctor from the University of Tulsa College of Law. The majority of Loyd's career has been in the natural gas industry, having held senior positions with a number of major energy companies, including Phillips Petroleum, Rosewood Resources, a Hunt Company, TransCanada, and AIG Trading. Mr. Drain has been a member of the Texas Bar since 1983, and today he has an energy consulting practice based in Houston, Texas. Loyd and I had a lot of fun co-chairing Governor Mead's Energy and Natural Resources Policy team. Loyd, it's great to have you here with us today. Seated next to him is Carly Ann Caruthers. Carly Ann, a fifth-generation Wyomingite, is the executive director of the Alliance for Historic Wyoming, a statewide nonprofit working to protect Wyoming's historic and cultural resources. She holds a BS in biology and an MA in American Studies and Environment and Natural Resources from the University of Wyoming. Her coursework specialized in historic preservation and sustainability with a focus on education, public discourse, and narrative as tools for planning for energy developments, particularly wind farms. She was gratefully influenced by her time working as a field technician at the High Plains McFadden Ridge Wind Farm. And last but not least, Mr. Kenneth. Ken is Senior Managing Director of the Rock Creek Group, an asset management firm based in D.C. that manages globally diversified portfolios of public and private assets for about 50 major institutional investors. Before joining Rock Creek at the end of 2010, he spent 28 years at the World Bank, where he acted as treasurer, a director heading his programs in countries in Latin America and Southeast Europe, and as head of its financial sector practice. Earlier in his career, Ken served as an enforcement lawyer with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He currently serves as a trustee of the Wyoming chapter of the Nature Conservancy and is a member of the steering committee for the Northern Laramie Range Alliance, a citizen group active in wind energy siting and rate-making matters. He holds a BA from Dartmouth, a Juris Doctor from George Washington, CFA designation, and has active membership in the State Bar of California. So here are your panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, our format today will be a round of introductory comments from each of your panelists, sharing the nature of their professional involvement on the wind issue with the organizations they represent. I'm going to then attempt to frame up the conversation with just a few thoughts for you. We'll follow by that a series of questions I'll ask our panelists to respond to, which I hope will be illuminating, and then of course we'll have time for your questions and responses. So this time I'd like to begin with Cale and just ask you to kind of introduce yourself and your take on wind.
Thank you very much, Milward. And thank you all for being here. I think it's really important that we're having this conversation in Wyoming. It's a conversation I've been trying to push for a couple of years now, as it became very evident that some very big changes are happening to our state. And so, I'm glad you're here, glad to contribute, and look forward to talking with you. Truly, I only know two things. There's just two things that I know about this. We need to get something for what we're giving up, because we are going to give up a lot. And the second thing is that the people that are developing and using our wind, and you may not realize that almost all of it is exported to other states. And in fact, some projects it's 100% exported. So the folks that benefit from that need to pay for it. And I put those two things together, and I come to the conclusion that we do have to look closer at Wyoming at our tax structure. We have to look at siting facilities, and we have to look at other ancillary things that are kind of driving the rush, and we want to drive it on Wyoming's terms, one of which is Wyoming's own interaction with PURPA. And I think Ken and I talked a bit about PURPA in a question this morning. So we are giving up a lot, because these are going to be very permanent projects. Once a place is developed for wind, there's not another use for it. We could easily be talking 100 years. So we're talking about our great-grandchildren. That's a powerful obligation to have us here at this table. People are getting a lot. Because if you look at all the maps of wind in the western grid, the best wind is in Wyoming. And they talk about, oh, Montana's got good wind and New Mexico's got good wind, but where that good wind is, it's not in the western grid. Now there are ways around that, but we have something that is enormously powerful. Those capacity factors are just huge, and we don't get enough. The property tax and the sales tax are inadequate. The long-term permanent employment, inadequate. The price paid per megawatt hour, inadequate in comparison to what they're getting. They're getting the best wind in the entire western grid. They're getting it for generations. And we need to pay attention to this and be at the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Loyd.
Thank you, Milward. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Most of my career was in the natural gas industry up until 2007, when I went to work for the state of Wyoming with the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, where I was an equal opportunity supporter of all of Wyoming resources, including coal, natural gas, wind, the whole 9 yards. So, and I am a climate change denier, and I'm not ashamed of that, but it's not climate change that is causing the revolution that's occurring today. It's economics 101. And wind prices are driving it. You know, we've seen, since 2010, we've seen wind production in the United States more than double. And more than double means over 40,000 megawatts. Even though Wyoming has over half of the quality wind in the country, we only saw less than 5% growth here in Wyoming during that same time period. You know, some people say, well, it's transmission. Some people say it's taxes. You know, there was another possibility brought up. It's just the rhetoric that occurs every time we turn around. There's new talk about taxes on wind. I would present to you and tell you that 40,000 megawatts of wind that was developed in other states in the United States, there wasn't 40,000 megawatts of transmission capacity being unutilized. It was just laying there. You know, we as Americans tend to be efficient and we utilize what we have. So a lot of our infrastructure in the country is being fully utilized. Same is true for electric transmission. So there was lots of transmission built in the United States in order to bring on that 40,000 megawatts. So we need to be mindful also that you can tax wind out of existence. And we haven't seen a lot of growth since 10, and we'll see what happens in the future. It's a very, very competitive business, very competitive. And profit margins are low. Wind is expected to get down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour in the next decade without any subsidies, and taxes will kill that development. So I would just caution that we need to be cautious of how, you know, we need to know what the model is for wind development, and that changes every day. So we need to have a model that changes every day to be able to know what the impact of that proposed tax is going to have on an industry that's capable of creating billions, literally, of tax revenues over the life of the project, creating lots of jobs. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, we're going to continue to see a decline in coal production, which means a decline in the number of jobs in the coal industry. And I personally, having spent over 20% of my career in Wyoming, my working life in Wyoming, it pains me to see that happen, but it's happening. So, but the state has an opportunity to help offset some of that loss, and wind can do that. And that's all I have to say.
All right, thank you very much, Loyd. Carlea?
I think I started paying close attention to wind energy in 2008, 2009. As a millennial who was interested in staying in Wyoming, I dug in, found a biology job, and started working at the High Plains McFadden Wind Farm. It was interesting. I'm actually a molecular biologist, so looking for dead birds wasn't top on the list of jobs, but it was here and it was good. So part of being a field biologist means that you're around walking, you're staring at the ground, you're staring at landscape features, you're looking at what's around you. And I had a really awesome opportunity to look at the McFadden landscape and see that we were sitting on layers and layers of not only biology and resources, but as a result of those things, history that sat on that same landscape. And so McFadden has been used for its natural resources by American Indians for centuries. There were oil seeps, so even those oil seeps were being used by the American Indians. And then we move into an era of company town. Company town eras are always interesting, usually an out-of-state interest moving in, taking the resources from that, and they literally took the town away and burned most of it down when they left. So that's an interesting legacy, and I don't mean that in a bad way either. I think in Wyoming we have to respect that all of these layers are important. They're all playing such a big role in our economic situation. But now on top of those layers, we also have these redevelopments of wind farms. So I think it's interesting to follow that trajectory and to talk about energy resources as cultural resources in Wyoming. It's so much of our history that we want to keep that going for future generations. So I was lucky enough to take that landscape view on this kind of fascinating trajectory of history and turn it into a thesis project for an American Studies and Environment and Natural Resources degree. And today I'm working with a nonprofit who wants to protect these historic and cultural resources for future generations. I'm really excited at this time that we're hearing so much about economic diversification and economic development in Wyoming, because all of us who are younger and want to stay here for another 5, or see our families at least stay here for another 5 generations, it's such a critical conversation. And I hope that through balance and good conversation that we can include cultural resources as a part of that. So I always introduce myself with the caveat that I do love historic preservation and I'm kind of obsessed with old places, in fact, but that does not mean that I'm stuck in the past and don't see that we have a future to plan for. So I hope that gives you some context.
Thank you, Carly. Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Milward. It's great to be here and to see everybody. I think many of you I've run into off and on during a lot of these conversations. I have been involved in wind energy financing indirectly at the World Bank for a number of years, but I really began focusing on this here in Wyoming in late 2008 when it became evident that Rocky Mountain Power was actually proposing to put a parallel segment of its Gateway West project to run directly across the northern Laramie Mountains in Commerce County. This, of course, triggered a huge amount of public concern. And at the same time, a wind energy developer had approached Osley saying, we would like to have you make available to us all the state lease land spreading about 100,000 acres across. It was 40,000 acres of state lease land, but it was covering an area that ran pretty much from Muddy Mountain down most of the way to Laramie Peak for a 3 gigawatt wind development up in the mountains there. And I think this was for all the reasons that Ricky had indicated, which is it's up high, you've got wind conditions that appear favorable and so forth. And so that process had gotten underway. Well, this triggered a huge amount of concern, and it led to the formation of a citizen group called the Northern Laramie Range Alliance, which I guess we ended up with just under 1,000 members having signed petitions on all these issues. However, and I emphasize this, it was interesting because pretty rapidly we also began to focus on the Public Service Commission regulatory issues, and actually quite independently of the siting. And we have remained engaged in the process at the PSC, particularly for the development of these qualifying facilities because of the way that power is priced, and we've represented our folks as ratepayers in that connection. But I think to focus on the things we're talking about here, one of the things I found in 2009 was that there was a great billboard that was up in a number of locations as you came into the state, and it had a beautiful scene of open Wyoming country with some critters in it, and it said, Wyoming's open, thank a rancher. And that, of course, I think epitomized, and it had been put up by the Stock Growers Association and some others, and that kind of epitomized, I think, both the issue and, of course, a lot of the values of the people, at least that I've been meeting in the state over all these years, that makes the place really unique. And when I have friends who come out either from the East Coast or who come from foreign countries, it's overwhelming to them, the openness and the value of all of that. And I think, and this is where I think wind has a huge challenge because of its landscape intensity. And, you know, I found the government did some numbers. People usually look at the Energy Information Authority or agency. I found these numbers from, of all people, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they did a review of all forms of energy and focused on its landscape intensity. By their calculation, wind, even taking into account the nameplate value, not the actual capacity, which is 45%, let's say, but the nameplate capacity is 150 acres per megawatt. If you apply the capacity factor, it's like 330 acres per megawatt. By way of comparison, natural gas, and this is including taking into account the drilling site, the pipeline to deliver the gas, the generating facility, comes in at 4.1 acres per megawatt, okay? So this gives you an idea of the challenge, I think, that wind faces, and it emphasizes, I think, that we cannot let the siting of these facilities happen idiosyncratically or by accident. We need to have a process in place that assesses the science, the habitat concerns, and so forth, the cultural issues, and incidentally, the economics, because it may be that unless we do some disciplined thinking, the economic values we give up if siting is not handled well are going to exceed the economic values we think we're getting out of this development. North Carolina came to that conclusion 30-something years ago and basically said, look, our tourism depends on the mountains, and we're not going to permit wind energy development above 3,000 feet in the state. And of course, they understood that they had a huge business in Smoky Mountains and areas just to the east of there, and yet they were finding, even then, that the early wind developers were thought that's pretty good because it's kind of windy up there. But they made that decision overwhelmingly in their legislature, and I think it's useful to keep that kind of thing in mind. So I do think that it's possible in Wyoming to find perfectly appropriate places for this form of generation. I think we can't do it by accident, and I think it's very important that the state here have an urgent and deliberate discussion about how to make this work.
All right. Thank you very much, Pam. Okay, so framing up this question of viewsheds, Western identity, Western values, I think we recognize here in Wyoming there are many paradoxes attached to our Western identity. For many years, my father, Dr. Pete Simpson, taught a very popular course here at UW called Wyoming's Political Identity. After exploring this question with very smart students and many guests for several years, he wrote an essay about what he learned about the topic. Quote, "To set the stage then, we can begin by saying that Wyoming's political identity is at least partly associated with place. Wyoming is the least populated state in the Union. We are high plains and mountains, the land of high altitude and low multitude," as my father used to say. "The tiny town with very, very long streets. The place where as long as it's 307, if you dial a wrong number, you're still going to know who you're talking to at the other end of the phone. We are connected to the outdoors in our state. We love our wildlife. And our energy sector workers love to hunt and fish as much as anybody else." He goes on to list some of our long-standing paradoxes. "We're anti-federal government, and at the same time, we gladly accept federal largesse. We're pro-economic development, but we don't want a lot of people moving in. We're pro-environmental protection, but anti-environmentalism. We identify with the mythical cowboy. The legislature in 2010 ratified the Cowboy Code as Wyoming's official state code. Well, our history is actually culturally diverse, and our economy is largely dependent on the energy industry. We pride ourselves on our rugged individualism, but somehow have always lacked the confidence to set our own course economically. The one aspect Dr. Simpson mentions that's not paradoxical flows from Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier theory. And again, I quote, "The frontier notion of a place where people are unfettered, free, with open space to live in and broad, untroubled vistas to view, is still in the American mythology and will, if past experience is any guide, likely never disappear. Wyoming and Wyomingites point proudly to their frontier heritage, and foreigners perceive America in that very same context. America was shaped by the frontier, and to them, Wyoming is the closest thing to a holdover of the frontier as any place in America." I don't know of one state tourism campaign that hasn't relied on our frontier heritage. From Forever West to all those pictures of our vast open spaces and cowboys riding the range in the That's Why program. There's a reason I'm wearing my bucking bronco tie today. So he concludes, Wyoming's political identity is made up of a fiercely patriotic, often parochial, always cautious constituency that prizes leaders who are plain-spoken, folksy, and accessible. We value tolerance of others, even those from the outside, as long as they accede to our deep-seated values and our sense of our image. We prize amateurism in politics and despise bureaucracy. We overcome a certain nagging inferiority complex brought on by our colonial status in the nation's economy with a patriotic pride that's fierce in being able to live in and appreciate the rugged, often hostile environment of which we are a part. We don't like to be thought of as mean-spirited, only conservative. And our self-image for all of our protestations is the mythical cowboy, rooted in our history, our landscape, and typical of what we feel to be our special nature as somehow a freer, more independent human being than those consigned to the rest of the globe. And the cowboy code. Well, what about that cowboy code? Here's the statute. Live every day with courage, take pride in your work, always finish what you start, do what has to be done, be tough but fair. When you make a promise, keep it. Ride for the brand, talk less, say more. Remember that some things are not for sale. Know where to draw the line. Do you agree? What are our shared values in 2017? What are yours? So, panel, let's dive in, and I'm going to ask each of you to respond to this. What values and or aspects of our Western identity are you most concerned about, and how might major wind development impact them?
Well, remember, I think we're getting a little long-winded with that question, actually. Talk less, say more. So I don't know about you guys, but I know you love Wyoming. I love Wyoming. I'm a guy that thinks there isn't a bad drive in Wyoming. I love the drive from Shoshone to Casper. I just love driving around this place, and you have this great, beautiful state just fall into your windshield of your car, and you just look, and you get the different lights, and you get, you think about you're seeing something that is probably like people have seen it for millennia, not millennial, by the way, but millennium. I think that's really important. And obviously, you can't have the whole state like that. We can't live like that. We can't feed ourselves like that. But it is important. It's very important. And when we think about giving that up for 100 years or more, in this big triangle that has its apex at the South Pass, and the lower leg of the triangle goes south of Cheyenne, and the upper leg goes through Casper and all the way into the Powder River Basin and beyond. That's a pretty big area that's targeted right now. And fine, I want to have that discussion, but don't jam that down my throat because you're rushing to make 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour because a federal tax credit is expiring. And all the companies admit that's what's driving this. And yes, wind economics are magnificent. The new towers are going to be bigger, and they're going to be more efficient, and they do fit into our energy policy. And this is not about I'm mad at wind because coal took it in the shorts. This is about severing something forever from my son over there, his children. Severing it. Wind is a renewable resource, but where those fields are located, they will be there forever, and they will sever something very important to you. To me, anyway. And we need to get something for that. We need to get something for that because we have to pay the freight. We have to send kids to school in 30 years, kids to school in 60 years. We have to build roads. We need a tax that's commensurate with the benefits that the best wind in the country, in the Western grid anyway, provides the developers. That's all I'm asking.
Thank you, Cale. So what are the values that you are concerned about, Loyd?
Thank you, Norman. And having worked, like I said earlier, over 20% of my career, I've lived in Douglas, Casper a couple of times, Cheyenne for about 9 years. You know, I can say we when it comes to Wyoming. I may not live here now, but I care about what happens to the state. And, you know, I was just sitting here thinking, if you did a poll, and it would be impossible to do, but if you did a poll of all the residents of all the states, and you asked those residents of each state, you know, give us a list of what you think your state's values are. I would dare say that Wyoming citizens are more aligned as to what the Wyoming values are than any other state. Wyoming's done a great job in developing an identity, but in order to be able to preserve that, you know, you can look at it two ways. You can say, well, we want to preserve it, or number two, what's going to impact it? You know, if the average citizen in Wyoming can't make a living wage, you don't need to worry about values, because there's not going to be anybody here except for people that, you know, have worked all their lives and can afford to live here. But you know, you fast forward 2 decades, and it's unfortunate, but you know, Wyoming coal production is going to be a third or even less. I hope it is a third. I hope it's a half. But that equates to a lot of jobs, and again, the state needs industries, whether it's wind or whatever, to be able for its citizens to earn a living wage and to have a reasonable expectation of services provided by the state. And again, wind represents an opportunity to do that. And as coal revenues do go down, there's an amount of money that it's going to take to run the state. So, you know, you just have to sit out and say, well, this gives us so much revenues, this gives us so much revenues, but, you know, we've got to have a certain amount to run the state. So, you know, wind turbines, and with all due respect, you know, nothing's forever. You know, wind turbines aren't forever. Coal production for generation, it seemed like forever, and it's been a nice ride, but it's not going to be forever. So we need that living wage. We need those jobs for the state.
Thank you, Loyd. So, Carly-Ann, what aspects of our Western identity are you concerned about, and how might wind development impact them?
So as someone involved in community development, I think it's interesting to go just about anywhere. You can always find creative places, interesting history, whatever it is that you're looking for, whether you're in the middle of Kentucky, up in Montana, or here. But what I think is unique to Wyoming is we really do truly have some of the last best places that have not been messed with, that do not have things imposed on top of them. And this is difficult with wind, because wind, you know, oil and gas is obviously on top of landscapes, but wind sticks up a little further, so you can see it from a long ways away. But I think what we stand to lose by opening wind development to at least all of Wyoming, I know I've heard it said that, you know, nothing will be a blanket of wind turbines all over Wyoming, but I think we stand to lose those last best pieces, like the National Historic Trails that cross Wyoming. You can't see those everywhere you go in Nebraska or all the way back to the Midwest where they started anymore, but in Wyoming you can still stand on those trails, see what someone might have seen in 1847 when they came through, and get that experience with your own sense. And so I think we stand to lose pieces of our history like that. And I will include with that, I think we also stand to lose, like at McFadden, we lost a landscape that could have taught us about the oil industry, and we lose pieces of that every time we put a new layer down. And so I'll go back to a point about balance will help us to preserve some of those values by making sure that there are areas where certain things are improved and certain things are preserved.
Thank you, Carly-Ann. Ken, what's your take on the Western values question?
Well, I keep coming back to the open space, because I think it's fundamental to what distinguishes all of these things. I think that has a lot of the personality of the people that I know in the state, and their warmth and everything is partly due to the fact that they're not buttoned up against each other all the time. I have some friends who think that appropriate population density is Chennai, okay? They suffer from serious agoraphobia when they visit here. And I think, the thing is, I think that we can preserve that while at the same time moving in the direction of this economic diversification that is so fundamental. I think I had my first conversation about this back in 1994 or 5 with Mike Sullivan and with Tom Strook. And they shared with me what the challenges have been to try to achieve that diversification. And then, because I know everybody in the state's been talking about it for years. But I do think it's possible, and I'm mindful that across the street, I'm being a little bit slightly facetious. Across the street from a 20,000-acre wind farm that Rocky Mountain Power has, and that it had reclaimed from a coal mine and so forth, there's McKinley Manufacturing in Glen Rock. Okay. Well, here's a doctor in Casper who invented, as many of you know, he invented a pioneering orthopedic drill bit, and he found that a lot of the guys who had lost their jobs in oil and gas and stuff had the skills to be able to move into this. So he probably occupies a half an acre and is employing, I don't know, 20-something of these folks. When I went to visit, they're making a very good amount of money. We're going to see if the business takes off. But suffice to say, his landscape intensity is dramatically lower than that wind farm across the street, where the operations and maintenance contract was employing, I don't know, 8 or 10, not the greatest wages, and the operations and maintenance company, at least when I last looked, was owned by the French French government-owned electric company. So I think it's a complex issue, and I think we have a risk that if we move in a rush, the way Cale was talking about it, we move in a rush, that we could find ourselves regretting it for a very long time. So it's unfortunate that this PTC issue seems to have put us in that mode.
Thank you. So, Cale, given what Ken said, can we protect the values we've been alluding to here and these aspects of our Western identity while still developing wind? Can we have it all?
I'm an economist, right? I'm supposed to say there's always a trade-off, and there probably is. I don't know if we can have it all, but we could do it better. We could definitely do it better. For example, we could get more tax revenue, and I think it's a no-brainer. The ability of a wind turbine to produce more electricity in Wyoming is a huge amount. Say it's 30% more, just to pick a number. Having 10% more taxes than we have now is not going to change the bottom line. That's a good deal for them. So we need to get more money. It's got to be sustainable, and it's got to be for the life of the project. Not front-ended, front-end loaded, like the sales tax is, which we're fine with that. The property tax, you've heard a lot of different numbers about the property taxes today. I think Dan Nobles, and I heard the good chairman, House Chairman of the Revenue Committee, I think the good chairman's numbers were a little high. The Department of Revenue indicates that we only get about $11,000 per turbine for a total of all the property taxes. Now that will change as new ones come online and they're bigger and all this stuff. But property taxes are still, they have a declining basis based on depreciation. So the revenue falls away, even though the production of the facility may not. So we're not getting enough money. We've got to get something long term. That's why the production tax, I'd like to see that raised. That's one thing. We could do a better job of siting. And the industrial siting has, it hasn't had to do much work in wind lately because there hasn't been any transmission. It's not about taxes, it's about transmission, believe me. And so industrial siting is going to get a workout. And they don't really have the tools, and there's a little bit of gaming that goes on where large wind projects are broken up into smaller ones to slip through the industrial siting and stay below the threshold. We need to fix that, not have that happen. That's the Wyoming equivalent of the PURPA 1 mile rule in a way. So we need to fix that here. We also have to look at PURPA. PURPA is federal law that requires to buy power from qualifying facilities. We need to modify how we look at that. The Public Service Commission has been approving 20-year contracts for these projects. We need to change that, and the reason we got to change that is because costs are falling like crazy in the industry. The bigger turbines are cheaper, they're better built, less maintenance, declining costs. If you are facing declining costs for renewables, why in the world would we lock into a 20-year contract for the price? So shorter contracts will take advantage of cheaper prices. We need to realize 85% or more of the energy leaves Wyoming. But the project is permanently here and has impacts for generations. That's why we have to do these things, to try to have it all in the best way we can. So we need to think about where they go. We need to think about sage-grouse. We need to think about other critters, believe me, they're important. And all the research that's been done that I've seen, and I've been trying to read a lot of it, shows that there are lots of studies of wind farms and biological things, and it's not pretty. We may hear different. But once you talk about mega-sized 1,000-turbine wind farms that take up 500 square miles of Wyoming, 1/2 of 1% of Wyoming with one project, the one in Carbon County. 1/2 of the total state. Astounding. I don't think we've thought through those biological impacts in terms of a huge area and the fact that critters can't move out of the way. So we've got a lot of work to do, but perhaps we can do it better. Will I ever be satisfied? Maybe not. I'm going to miss my Wyoming, but let's try to do a better job together. And the money's there to pay for it.
Thanks, Cale. So Loyd, can we conserve our Western identity and develop wind? What are the trade-offs?
Well, I have to believe we can, and I do agree that, if you look at most of the quality wind in the state, it's in the Wheatland-Chugwater area, and it's in south central Wyoming, around Rawlins, in that general vicinity. And yes, there's biological, wildlife, Indian, historical treasures in those areas as well. Luckily, it's not close to Yellowstone National Park or the Grand Tetons, but I got to believe we have. But again, I think it goes back to having a full understanding of how much revenue it's going to take to run the state and where that's going to come from. And then we have to pick and choose, what we're willing to give up. Do we want a state income tax? Do we want to follow Colorado's lead in legalizing marijuana? There's a lot of ways we can that the state can generate taxes. But it's just a matter of, and we're always hopeful, and I believe in most cases that Wyoming has an excellent representation in the legislature, but we're always hopeful that the legislature is aligned with the citizens within Wyoming, and we just have to pick and choose. We need X amount of dollars to continue to run the state in the manner that people are accustomed to. And what are we willing to accept, what are we willing to give up? But I do believe we can maintain those those Wyoming, not just Western values, but Wyoming values.
Thanks, Loyd. So Carly Ann, when I was working with the state a long time ago, a very wise man who many of you know, I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, Rob Hurlis, asked him about wind energy development, and he thought that the Wyoming values factor was going to loom large at some point in the future of wind. He said, there's going to be a limit on what Wyomingites will be willing to tolerate at some point when it comes to impacts on the viewshed in the landscape. So let's dig a little bit more into this question of the viewshed. What role, Carly Ann, do our viewsheds play in our Western identity and our values? And what measures should be taken, if any, to define and protect them?
Yes, so this is definitely the open space question. So I think I mentioned earlier that the viewshed for wind energy is difficult because, as you all know, we have towers that rise hundreds of feet in the air with spinning blades and blinking red lights that are now on top of hills. These things are visible for miles, and so where you are used to seeing nothing and seeing sky and seeing mountains or whatever was in that forward background can now be obscured by these large towers. And so that is the big viewshed question. And this has been addressed with other types of energy before, and it's a lot easier to screen things like drilling rigs, to paint any of those oil and gas compression stations to match the hillside behind them, and that's just really difficult to do with something so large as a turbine. I know I've heard people ask about if you could just paint them so at least the towers disappear, paint them so the blades disappear, but I know that opens up a whole host of other questions about maybe wildlife. You need to be able to see these things too, and at some point the blades also spin, so this is going to be tricky. So I think the open space question is so important because we've been spoiled for years now to have such wonderful open spaces in Wyoming, and I think many of us are unwilling to give that up. And I think this is also an interesting private property question. Most of us, if we have a house, we wouldn't be so thrilled for someone to build something that obscured our view to the Tetons when we just built across Jackson Lake or something like that. So I think if you can bring this back down to a very personal level, we also understand that tug, and then all of us probably understand that tug when we're out hiking and seeing those view sheds as well. So there is some good work being done on this, and this is, I think, this was mentioned at the beginning that this is we're a little into the subjective, into the qualitative and not the quantitative. And so there are systems in place that are trying to quantify what visual resources mean, both for economics, and so this brings in things like tourism, even hunting and things like that can be impacted if that's affecting what your wildlife are doing in these open spaces. And then also just looking at the actual landscape of place. So the BLM has a visual resource management tool where they try to look at viewshed qualities, things like color, vegetation, landform, any water in the area, adjacent scenery, things like the scarcity of a viewshed. Is this something truly unique, like a Yellowstone, like a Grand Teton, or is this some kind of, I guess, I don't want to say typical, that sort of undermines how valuable these things are, but something that is more typical and that we have more of it, and giving the meaning that then maybe we can mess it up a little more because we have more of it. And then also any cultural modifications. Cultural modifications along a viewshed might be important too, whether that's a bridge viewscape, archaeological resources on top of hillsides, things like that. And so in trying to quantify all of these pieces of what our viewshed and open space means, we can then come up with a system of what are the most precious viewsheds that we do not want to lose into those viewsheds that are either, most of the time when it's allowed to make these modifications, it's because it's already been messed with. And so I think this goes back to the last question too, of how are we going to preserve these values. I think one of the most important things to do is site these properly and to also keep wind farms in places where they are already operating. There's so much of a maintenance and long-term impact question here for our power companies and us as consumers to consider. I think the other thing about viewsheds and open space is just this awareness to really start questioning people and getting a sense of the public's view of what they value most. So it's not just all of us out in the field who do this every day going, oh, yep, this is colorful, this has this kind of scenery, this is a Class 2 viewshed. To really ask people like you and I what we value, whether it's our range in Converse County that we want to keep for future generations, whether it is that Grand Teton landscape or something like, I know the red desert comes up over and over again as a landscape that maybe not everyone wants to hang out in, and it definitely is a desert, but it's unique to Wyoming and it's an amazing cultural value for a lot of people.
So Carly Ann and Ken, I recently had a chance to go out on the Upper Sweetwater Preserve, which is a Nature Conservancy property. It abuts a lot of federal land southeast of Atlantic City, and to stand there on a segment of the old Oregon Trail with Oregon Buttes in the background, and basically to be able to see what the pioneers actually saw is really an incredibly rare thing. And I know you probably work with folks like Okta, who are the first to say Wyoming has the best remaining pristine viewsheds in terms of these segments of trail left in the country. So Ken, same question to you. What role do these viewsheds play? Can we take measures to identify and protect them and still develop this resource?
Well, yes, I think we can. I should mention I've got my great-great-great-grandfather's diary, and he had some, not to particularly favorable comments about the Platte River when he left to moved over to the Sweetwater. So he would have appreciated all of this. But I think that it's possible. I think the key issue and Carly-Ann mentioned it, is how do we facilitate serious public engagement to get these viewpoints articulated? It's really tough because, and I've gone through the experience over the last 7 or 8 years, I can't tell you how many people were very concerned, but they can't show up at every hearing. They've got day jobs, and we need to have mechanisms that are going to give them the opportunity to get their viewpoints fairly and squarely heard, so that we can, to help us make these decisions about how to prioritize these values. And I think I have a suspicion that we would find more commonality if we were to really set up a way to do that than we might initially think. And I think this gets to a point that I keep coming back to, which is I think it's really, it would be, I think, actually very helpful to the industry, all parts of it, both the utilities and the independent power producers, if ex ante there were identification of the areas that were on the table for this kind of development, and then that would expedite the permitting process and all that. But to get that done, of course, we need to have that public engagement so that we can make that happen. I think that would help make Wyoming extremely attractive as a destination, because there would be certainty around issues that, as of today, are going to take a several-year process in the industrial siting division and council and in the Public Service Commission and so forth. And I don't think those things are incompatible. But I do think that we have got to do this in a careful and orderly way, taking into account all of these issues and making sure that the public has had an opportunity to engage on them. And that hasn't been easy.
So Cale, how about this viewsheds issue? Are some viewsheds more valuable than others?
Well, I suppose so. Certainly some are pristine, and I've been kind of outspoken on wind energy in the past couple of years, and I've had people rip into me and say, but where were you when oil and gas was being developed and the Jonah Field and all that? And they've got a point. But I will point out that this impact of these giant turbines is even more prevalent and more permanent. And if you just look at, like, coal mines are reclaimed, eventually when oil and gas fields are reclaimed, nothing's going to reclaim this because it's always going to be productive and used for that purpose. So that tells me there is a difference here. There's significant height, there are biological impacts, there's a difference. But when it comes back down to it, Milward, it seems like where we have a pristine Wyoming, it's worth talking about trying to keep it that way, for the most part. And you know where those special spots are. A lot of them are already preserved, but it's beginning to weaken. And do you think in 30 years the nation's quest for energy and renewable energy is going to be any less? We're facing this pressure for a long, long time, unless there's a different technology, unless the Tesla battery and distributed generation and all these things are possible. We may be facing, pressure on these areas for 100 years. So we need to start kind of slow and carefully. And there will always be people in the future. There will be new credits. There will be new reasons. It's not a one-time, you have to do it now. And if you don't do it now, it's over. And I refuse to be boxed into that kind of thinking, because we're better than that in Wyoming. And the wind has been here forever. If you look out past Laramie, you'll see those big depressions where the jet stream is scooped out. You see sand dunes that you fly over, some stabilized by a very fragile amount of swell. It's all there. It's been there for basically ever. So the demand will be there forever. Lord, we've got to try. We've got to try. We've got to say, we make zones or whatever. We've got to do something. You can't just let the developers drive the agenda as to where it goes. Stand up, Wyoming.
All right, thank you, Cale. So, Loyd, question for you. We're going to take this back to another aspect of our Wyoming identity, which is that often the conversation around economic diversification kind of seems like Groundhog Day in this state. We seem to have talked about that for decades. I'm just as excited or more so than anybody about the Endow initiative. That seems to me to have a lot of juice and a lot of power and opportunity. And I'm really pleased my friend Jeremiah Riemann is leading that effort for the governor. But Loyd, how does large-scale wind development possibly help or hurt other opportunities for diversification in the state? For example, tourism.
Well, it definitely impacts, and somewhat it goes back to possibly some identifying some different zones, because viewsheds are one viewshed may be more valuable than the other to Wyoming, but it's interesting. I flew up to Denver on Sunday afternoon, and from Oklahoma City, and I was visiting with a total stranger there that he and his wife had just got back from just coincidental from Yellowstone, and they drove pretty much the entire I-80. And I asked him, I said, a light came on my head. I said, I've got to ask you this question. I said, so which did you find more offensive? Those wind farms that were, impacting the view of the landscape, or those 18-wheelers? And, in about 2 nanoseconds, he said, hey, the 18, you can't pay any attention to anything but trying to avoid those 18-wheelers on I-80. And I realize Wyoming's blessed with lots of different highways that don't have a plethora of 18-wheelers around. So, but I do think that, I personally don't think it would impact tourism. You got to remember, if you look at NREL puts out data for each state, and you look at the potential of wind that could be developed in Wyoming, we have enough power to power the whole United States. So, and we're not going to get all that market share. Trust me. Keen competition. Last 7 years, 40,000 megawatts was developed. We got 80. So it's a very competitive. And one other thing too, Milward, that I want to point out as far as viewsheds concerned, we're not going to develop any wind if we don't have transmission. So, and transmission has viewshed issues too. So, that's something to be ever mindful of. And again, I think it goes back to knowing what it's going to take in revenues to run the state and provide services to our citizens, knowing what type of quality jobs can we develop here in Wyoming to provide a reasonable living wage for our people. It's more than just hating wind or hating anything. It's all those factors combined, and how do we balance all of that and be able to continue having a great state like Wyoming has been, and Lord willing will continue to be.
All right, how about the rest of you? Is wind part of kind of an all of the above economic diversification strategy, or there's some incompatibilities with other aspects of diversification? Anyone else want to take it?
I would say that this goes, again, back to proper siting. I think wind energy absolutely has the power to impact tourism, which is our second largest industry. We cannot knock tourism. No one's necessarily complaining about these along the I-80 corridor, love it or hate it, but I know that people would probably have something to say about them next to Yellowstone National Park. And so someone made a collective decision, in 18 something for Yellowstone becoming a national park that protects it from that. And so we now need to do the job, I think, to protect some of these other places. I also think, I said that Wyoming is one of the last places to see some of these truly untouched areas. And so I think it's also important to think that while Chugwater is a very different landscape from Yellowstone National Park, they have other neat things that deserve at least to be noticed, to be evaluated, and to be considered before we plunk something down like this that is so permanent on top of them. And I think we're in a really cool position right now. We have amazing technology where we can use GIS to do multiple layers of maps to show this is where the high quality wind energy resource is. This is where it's red on that map that we need to put all the turbines in. And then we can narrow that down to say this is where cultural resources are. These are the landscapes that somebody in that community identified as important. These are what the tourists from out of state identified as important. We can map all of that out and really try to hone in on these areas where it makes the best sense to put some of these. The other thing that I always think comes up for tourism is I hear from a lot of people that they're fascinated. Not everyone gets to see these in their own state, and so when they drive down the interstate and see tons of white towers or tons of red lights at night, people want to know what that is. And so I think it would be amazing for Wyoming to capitalize on this energy tourism and give people the opportunities to understand why their light switch came on this morning and why that works. So whether that's taking them to a coal mine when they're here, whether that's taking them to a wind farm, which is an awesome experience to stand underneath one of the, Pacific Aurora is probably cringing to think of inviting the public to stand underneath a wind turbine right now. But I think that's an awesome opportunity for Wyoming to really explain that we're the energy capital, we'd like to stay the energy capital, and we hope you all understand how and why this looks, how and why it works and what it looks like.
All right, thanks. So we fully realize that we're the only thing standing between you and this reception. And yeah, so let's go ahead and move to questions from the audience. See one over here, right behind you.
We got one over here.
Hi. My name is Emma Jane Alexander and I manage the 3D Visualization Centre based in the School of Energy Resources. I don't have a question, but I have a comment for you this afternoon, and that's that I feel that a member of the public would feel very empowered and engaged if they could take out their mobile phone, hold it up to the landscape, and then see the actual proposed changes to their view shed immediately. And this is about making the technology in our pockets help the process that you're talking about right now, not necessarily trying to leverage the beautiful $3 million visualization facility we have, but using the expertise in content development and GIS that you already mentioned, Cale, but being able to use your phone. So I'd like to invite all the attendees and all the panelists today to, at some point at your convenience, visit the Viz Centre so we can consider how we can play a role in helping the members of the public be a crucial part of this conversation.
All right, thank you. Very great to be aware of. Here's technology.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Milward, I am one of the major questions that you are asking is, can we have it all? And from where I sit, we can't have it all. Maybe we can have pieces of it distributed around the state, and that way maybe have it all. But you know, your organization, the Nature Conservancy in the country of Mongolia, they've done this development by design. And I don't know how you pulled that off, but still it's a plan where you have planned for development throughout at least the entire third of the country, eastern third that I've seen. I know you're working with the rest of the country now. To me, it seems like what is needed here is a comprehensive state plan for not just wind, but coal, but view sheds. It's a complicated thing to do. And one of the principles that's come out so far today is that we don't have a lot of time to do planning. But I still think we need to do a concerted effort on planning and a statewide comprehensive plan. And I guess I'd ask you and the panel if that's possible, if that's where we should be going. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question for sure. I can tell you with the Nature Conservancy, for one thing, we can be proud in Wyoming that our state chapter actually pioneered the whole development by design concept, which then has been propagated, which is great. We're working right now on something called the Sited Right wind energy kind of database development tool that will allow us to take into account all kinds of data related to wildlife patterns and behavior and habitat and impacts, and looking forward to coming up with some of that soon. We had a wind panel not dissimilar to this just for our board last week. And one of the things that our board members strongly reacted to is kind of this revelation that there hasn't been a lot of robust, comprehensive planning around this issue, getting back to the first wind energy rush, and now the next rush that's about to hit us. So members of the panel, how important is comprehensive planning? Do you agree that we need to do it, and do we have time?
Well, we definitely need to do it. We should have started a long time ago. Right now, the tools that are on the table, for example, I would like, for example, the governor created a task force on tourism. I think we should do a task force on wind energy, get some people going right now. We don't have time for the legislature to meet because they're not going to meet until February. It's a budget session, and if anybody wants to create mischief with any bill that requires planning or whatever, they only need to get 1/3 of the legislature to oppose its introduction. So procedure-wise, we're kind of in a rough shape. But the executive, could lead us in this direction by maybe creating an executive task force and beginning that process. Maybe the legislature can follow up after we convene. It might be a good thing for a budget amendment, for example. You don't need 2/3 on a budget amendment to do something like that. If it's, yes, we need the planning. It's been so crazy. Everybody has said, well, Wyoming, you put in this $1 per megawatt tax, so it killed wind development in Wyoming for all these years since 2010. That's not true at all. There was no transmission, and some of us have been saying that. It's a transmission problem. It's a transmission problem. Lo and behold, it's a transmission problem. And as we see the transmission problem being solved in a couple of areas, some of which are by backing off on coal and using that transmission to go west and then extending from Jim Bridger into the Shirley Basin, the problem becomes solved, and it's not the taxes. It's all about transmission, and the rush is on. We don't have much time. The governor could act very quickly and establish a task force. There'll be some legislation in the legislature about taxes. There'll be legislation about industrial siting, and there'll be legislation about PURPA. But we won't find out how all that goes until the session. And it is a budget session, so there is the politics. There's also an effort to have an initiative to increase the wind generation tax. And there's been an opinion rendered that says that we can have a tax by initiative as long as it's not for a specific purpose. And so some folks are exploring that and moving forward on that. I look at it as the tax possibly as being a little bit of a throttle. And I am not satisfied with the mad rush to get it all permitted in now. I'm not satisfied with that. We need more time.
One more quick answer so we can fit some more questions in. Another take on the planning piece. Anybody else want to come in?
I just keep coming back to this point. I think, and I think Rick Rand had mentioned that as soon as you begin talking about this, then you get into the Z word, zoning. And we know how many places in the state that is anathema. We can't stay there. I make this point because this is, every time I recall talking with Governor Freudenthal about this years ago, when he had gone around the state with a presentation that showed what the implications were if the proposals that at that time, I think, Loyd, you and your colleagues were discussing in the Infrastructure Authority for wind development in the state. But he understood then that any effort to try to ex ante determine appropriate places for this, you run into this issue that people say, oh, but you can't tell me what I can and can't do with my land. I would make the point that that, of course, works two ways, but I would also make the point that the certainty and making the permitting process more expeditious actually could be beneficial to responsible developers and to the public utility. And then again, I agree with Cale. if the kind of priority got attached to this, it wouldn't take forever because there's a lot of information out there that's already, I think, I'm always surprised when I find out how much work has already been done. And I would mention in the case of the Nature Conservancy, they had completed specifically for the purpose of assisting in wind energy siting, a survey of the entire state with respect to avian densities of different categories of birds and all that stuff. And you can look at that. There are maps. They get down to a high degree of detail that will show you what is the relative density of these different species. And I know there's been a huge amount of work on ungulate migration, things of that kind. When I have conversations with friends who are in the sportsmen for fish and wildlife and things like that, they are very concerned about these kinds of things, and I think would welcome an explicit opportunity to come in and help get something like this done.
Okay, over here.
Hello, I'm Sarah Strauss. I'm a professor in the anthropology department here at UW, and I appreciate all of the diverse perspectives we've been getting all day. And I haven't had to duck out to the office for a bit, but so maybe I missed this, but I feel like we actually did some of this prep work many years ago, about 10 years ago now, when we had the Doing It Smart from the Start documentation, right? That Biodiversity Conservation Alliance put together, that people were, in fact, I would say Wyoming was way ahead of the curve in looking at the trade-offs across these different options that we have for siting, for scale, for all of these other issues. And I'm kind of feeling today like that just got tossed out, nobody's paying attention, nobody's updating it, and we have to start over from scratch. I think not, because I think we actually did do a very good job of laying groundwork. I think we went astray. I think chokecherry, for example, is something that maybe did not fit in well, and there were other politics that led us in that direction. But that document is a really good place to go back to right now, because I think it was done very thoughtfully with a lot of input from across the state and was approved and can help us see ways forward. So I just wanted to bring that up because I hadn't heard anybody mention it before. Thanks.
All right, thank you for bringing that up. Other questions? Just going to get there first. Okay, over here.
Jessica Western, World Size Institute. I was just wondering, and this panel may not be the one that can address this, but if you have any thoughts, I'd be interested. But what about technology? I mean, right now we're looking at blades, but there are other designs. And when we're talking about values, Milward, some of these values, these interests, could be addressed by different designs that still generate the same amount or maybe even more electricity. I don't know anything about it, but I just wanted to throw that into the discourse. Any thoughts?
Do we have a panel tomorrow that's likely to address that, Rob? Probably not, okay. Do we have anybody here who is knowledgeable of the different designs for wind energy technology?
Yeah, I'd say over the last decade in particular, things like direct drive, permanent magnet direct drive, for example, where you eliminate the gearbox, the way that the blades are pitched. These are things that are definitely still, the jury's out on some of those kinds of things, but the three-bladed upwind turbine is unanimously, all the OEMs, all the designers, in terms of lowest cost of energy. That's why, as Professor Naughton explained this morning, we are in a position we're in today where it does beat, all other forms of generation right now. So it is, just to answer the question for now, I will tell you that all the OEMs, of course, they've got their think tanks and their research centers working on other technologies, bladeless turbines, for example, and other such things. They're just not economically viable right now. The three-bladed upwind turbine is that winner.
Any other comments on that question? All right, I think we have a question over here.
Faster.
Having attended last Friday the grand opening and ribbon cutting at the Native American Education Research and Cultural Center. I find your definition of pristine from a point of view that's less than 200 years old inappropriate. If we had any Native Americans in here, I think they might say that things are not pristine any longer in this state whatsoever. So when coal and oil and then the interstate highway system went through the state and the buffalo disappeared, things are not pristine. And so things are moving on, and we have to keep that in mind, that the Wyoming values are less than 200 years old, and there are much older values that we pretty much dismissed. And looking at the state from a reservation is not the best sighting either.
No, absolutely, and I do appreciate that comment. I think, I don't know, I'm sorry that I'm not quantifying all that, but I want to go back to those histories, because I think one of the things that gets the most disrupted by some of these turbines is all of the, I guess, not, we won't say pristine, but less disturbed things like teepee rings, all these things that end up on the top of ridges. And I think that's one of the most connecting pieces to American Indian culture, is that we all have this desire to get to the top, to see the vista around us, to do things like that. And there's so much of that that is not left. It's not in the history books, it's nowhere. And so I hate to further destroy what is a landscape-oriented sort of education from pieces like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right that we need to do a better job of representing everybody who's traversed this state and all of the resources that all of the people who've benefited from the resources that it offers.
All right, thanks for that important perspective.
I was glad to hear that transmission lines were mentioned a couple of times. We not only have the impact to habitat and the viewshed of the siting of the wind energy production facility itself, but if that energy has to get to market, which is 85% outside of Wyoming, those transmission lines are going to march across our landscape, and they're going to change our viewshed. It's going to be habitat fragmentation on the ground as well as up in the air, and I'd like to hear some comments on that topic.
Comments on fragmentation. Ken, you want to take a crack at that? Or do you want to pass?
Well, no, I think it's important to. I think there is a distinction between the grid, long-distance transmission lines, where you've already got Gateway West. What's going to happen is all that's going to get reinforced more or less along the same corridor. But then you have, and this is a bit different, all the collector lines. And those of you, then these are the lines that connect the individual wind facilities to the grid. And I think that has a potential to be very seriously disruptive. The state, until, I guess, mid-2015, had a very, and I think Kermit Brown had been important to this in the legislature, had in place a provision that you couldn't use eminent domain to force private developers' collection lines across intervening property. And I think that puts some care and restraint on this. But I think it's crucial that it be part of the discussion because of the nature of all of this.
Loyd, do you have a response?
One thing I'd like to mention is hopefully later on this month, for sure in the next 6 weeks or so, NREL is going to be releasing their SEAM, that's capital SEAM, which basically stands for the seam that divides the east, west, and ERCOT grids. But one of the look for one of, and it'll be in the press, but I think a lot of people aren't aware that this study is being made. Basically what it is, it's a transmission overlay, a bidirectional HVDC overlay that will connect the entire eastern, western, and Texas grids. It takes wind-rich, it goes through wind-rich areas to collect wind, quality wind obviously, solar-rich areas to tap the solar, natural gas-rich areas to tap the natural gas, and delivers that to load centers around the country. You know, one of the findings, I think, especially folks that are concerned about viewshed, and I mentioned it myself earlier, but one of the findings is when you transfer, they have found, NREL, which is part of the Department of Energy, they have found that when you transfer large amounts of power, that it becomes economical to bury transmission. So that's a positive thing from a viewshed standpoint. So I'm looking forward to that study, as I know a lot of you are looking forward to it as well.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions? All right, well, I would very much like to add my thanks to Rob and everyone who helped put on this forum. Really appreciate the attempt to bring all of these complex ways of looking at this issue together. And this is difficult stuff when we're talking about defining Western values, Western identity, viewsheds, all these trade-offs, our entrepreneurial spirit, our need to develop resources in a balanced way. So I'd really like to ask you to join me in thanking this wonderful panel for their insights on this topic.
Thank you for that. Thank you to all the panelists and presenters today. I think we all learned something. And thank you for sticking with us as we dive deep into wind energy. It's been a long, interesting day.